Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation of Florida Snowbirds, from Vagabonds to Visitors, sponsored by the Clearwater Age and Well Center. Because I've lived my entire life in Florida, I was quite familiar with the term Florida Snowbirds. I also knew growing up that my great-grandparents, my mother's maternal grandparents, were early Florida Snowbirds. You can see them pictured here in their 1901 wedding photo. In this picture, you can see my great-grandmother and her children standing in a Florida orange grove. This picture was probably taken around 1913 or 1914. I can estimate the date of the photo because of the apparent age of my grandmother, who is the oldest girl pictured here on the far left. I know that the family spent time in Florida that winter because my grandmother kept her booklet of school tickets. In the days before modern school buses, she took the trolley back and forth to school each day while they spent the winter in St. Petersburg. My great-grandparents divorced in 1923 and each remarried and continued to be Florida Snowbirds. My great-grandmother and her second husband wintered in various locations around Florida until they finally moved permanently to St. Petersburg in the late 1940s. They were soon followed by my grandparents. My grandmother and my grandfather arrived in the early 1950s. Because I wanted to learn more about what life was like for these early Florida snowbirds, such as my great-grandparents, I decided to do some hunting in the early Florida newspapers to see what they had to say. In order to do a search, I needed to know what terms to use. I found that the most often used term was visitors, such as northern visitors or winter visitors. They also used the word tourists, such as hotel tourists and auto tourists, even for those who spent several months or more during the winter. And of course, I looked for the term snowbirds. One thing that I quickly found was that snowbirds had a different connotation in the early 1900s than it does today. This presentation will use examples from those early Florida newspapers to show how the term snowbird was used and how it evolved between 1900 and the 1970s. I found no use of the term snowbird in relation to winter visitors between 1900 and 1909. However, I found a lot of mentions about the visitors who came each winter, such as this 1901 example, which stated almost all the northern visitors left this week. Because these Florida visitors were such an important part of the growing economy, Florida cities knew that they needed to find ways in order to improve and keep these visitors coming back each year. In this example from a 1901 article about a proposed road project, it stated Florida needs good roads more than perhaps any other state. It would be a beautiful and popular drive for the people of the city and of the tourists in winter. Early newspapers were an important source of entertainment. The early papers loved to include gossipy articles about all of the comings and goings, both of the locals and of the winter visitors. They even listed many of the visitors by name and would tell when they arrived and when they left each year. As you can see in this 1906 example, which stated that Charles F. Pitt left this week for the East Coast and will spend some time at various points en route to his home at Corning, New York, where he will arrive about May 1st. In the second decade of the 1900s, the newspapers continued to make mention of the winter residents who came each year, and they began adding regular columns in the paper with information geared to this group. They also began adding additional names for them, such as here in the 1913 article entitled "The Page That Hotel Tourists Look For," and in 1915 article entitled "Auto Tourists on Way South." In these early years, they asked the people who were coming to the area to register at the Board of Trade, what would today be the Chamber of Commerce. This was a way for them to track how many people had come each year and where they were coming from. In this 1914 example for St. Petersburg, it states that the tourist registrations at the Board of Trade rooms shows an increase of 18% over the registered last winter at this time. And then it proceeded to list each of the locations these people had come from and how many. The top 5 that year were Ohio at 1,144 visitors, Illinois with 789, New York State with 738, Indiana with 721, and the New England states with 674. The first time that I found the use of the term snowbird in reference to an early Florida visitor was in a 1911 article from St. Lucie County. It stated, "The list of Ancona's visitors is rapidly growing. Many have already arrived, attracted by the unsurpassable South Florida climate. And before the end of the week, there will be scarcely a house which does not harbor a snowbird or two." This use is very much as we use the word today. However, the next time I found the term used in 1913, it began to take on a different connotation, and those who were referred to as snowbirds began to be separate from the ordinary winter visitors. In this article, an advertisement from a Tampa doctor, he warned people about those who were coming to Florida each winter in order to peddle fake medical cures. He entitled it "The Snowbird Specialists," which he identified as those who linger in the north in his home until about this season, when he comes hither to fatten for a few brief weeks, leaving at the early approach of spring. From this point through the next 2 or 3 decades, the use of the term snowbird increasingly came to mean con men, beggars and vagrants, seasonal workers who would come south to work for lower wages than the locals, temporary and questionable businessmen that operated during the winter months in order to take advantage of the tourists and other undesirable visitors. In this 1915 classified ad, a young stenographer, in his advertisement posting his availability for employment, made sure that he identified himself as not being a snowbird. And this 1915 article stated, the snowbird who comes down from New York or Chicago is given employment in preference to the resident. In 1915, at the beginning of that tourist season, Lakeland posted an article which stated, "Watch the vagrants. Many of the Florida cities are preparing for the winter rush of snowbird tourists who seek the balmy climb of this state in the winter to beg, borrow, or steal." In response to this group, cities in Florida started to create ordinances in order to restrict their movements. In this 1916 St. Petersburg article, it stated, the proposed ordinance is intended to protect the merchants of the city against the encroachments of the snowbird dealers who come here and open temporary businesses to reap a harvest during the tourist season. In 1916, Lakeland stated, good and evil are pretty thoroughly mixed in this old world. Along with the tourists, whom we are all happy to welcome, there's a goodly sprinkling of snowbirds, fellows who are here to live through the winter season by their wits or by imposing on the charity or credulity of our people. Give the snowbird and his schemes little consideration. And later that month, they stated, beggars and all kinds of undesirable snowbirds will not be tolerated in Tampa this winter. The chief of police giving orders that all must leave town immediately. In 1917, Miami posted an article which stated, the Clearwater Sun notes that some of the snowbirds have already arrived in Florida and that scores of them will soon be here to live off other people with schemes of various sorts until next spring. From all accounts, too, there will be more of these folks in Florida this winter than ever before. They know a good thing when they see it. And in 1919, shortly after the end of World War I, a St. Petersburg article stated, the annual invasion of Jacksonville as the gateway to Florida by confidence men, wiretappers, snowbirds, deft-fingered artists, and other members of the profession addicted to the avowed purpose of plucking the feathers from the working portion of the nation. The German army had little on these organized exponents of the light-fingered arts. In light of all of these articles, which talked about Northerners coming to take advantage of the winter visitors, I thought it was rather interesting when I came across this 1917 article, which said, just now, winter visitors are coming into St. Petersburg in greater numbers than ever before. It is not necessary to urge upon the real loyal St. Petersburg residents to treat these tourists as guests rather than as victims to be worked for every cent they are worth. In other words, it wasn't only the Northerners who sometimes took advantage of the winter visitors. By the 1920s, you can start to see a shift in how the word snowbird is used, as it begins to be used occasionally to describe someone other than the unwelcome visitors. as can be shown here in this 1920 example, which states Miss Margaret Miller of Lake Placid Club has just arrived in Miami to visit her mother. Although she is really a snowbird and does not object to the frozen north, she has expressed herself as being immensely pleased with Miami's climate. Although snowbird is not used quite the same way here, I think it's notable that it was used at all during this time period to describe someone who's obviously one of the more well-off northern visitors. In a 1922 letter to the editor, in response to someone's previous letter, the writer states, "I think Mr. Packwood expressed his only real objection to Mr. William Jennings Bryan when he called Mr. Bryan Snowbird, meaning a northern-born and reared man." Obviously, this particular writer did not see the term as a negative. And in this 1923 article about letters coming in to the St. Petersburg Chamber of Commerce in advance of the 1924 season, stated, "Some of the snowbirds who are icebound in the frozen north this winter must believe that the earliest bird catches the worm." However, throughout this period, snowbird is still used as a derogatory or mocking term, as shown here in this 1920 Palm Beach example. "Best and stiff hat betrays snowbird first of season." In some sections of the country, the coming of the first robin is as important an event as the 4th of July or Groundhog Day, for it is presumed to presage the near appearance of a new season of the year. In South Florida, the land of eternal spring, the robin is not a bird qualified for the function it performs in the north. Here, there is another harbinger than the robin. It is the snowbird, the meaning of which is well known to residents, although it may be cryptic to those to whom it is applied. "I saw it first," said the observant barger. "The first snowbird of the season. He wore a stiff hat and a vest and a coat on his arm, and he was on Banyan Street looking for a place where he could get a square meal for 35 cents. And this 1920 article, which stated the ordinance will tend to do away with the so-called snowbird taxi drivers who come here each season to hire out their cars. Obviously, this was an early version of Uber, where people would come down with their own vehicles and pick up fares for less money than the regular cab services. And this 1922 article shows that it was not only adults who were taking advantage of the warmer weather. There is a complaint in Miami that husky newsboys coming down from the north to spend the winter are driving the smaller local newsies from their stands. They are called snowbird rowdies. And in a 1926 article, which quotes the chief of detectives for the St. Petersburg police, he said, "What crime we have here is solely to a lot of snowbirds who come here to escape the vigorous winters of the north, and when they are unable to find employment, they turn to paths of crime." Somehow I doubt that it was only the northern snowbirds who were committing crimes. In the 1930s, the term snowbird appears to have fallen out of favor for a time, at least in the newspapers. The only example of its use that I could find was this 1932 article where someone wrote in stating, "Every person entitled to remain in these United States belongs somewhere. If he has a home state, it is where he belongs, if he has not the wherewithal to live and pay his way elsewhere. And if he has not a home state, he belongs in any institution to which he may be consigned. Running snowbirds out of Florida communities, if the purpose is to send them back where they came from, is all right." So you can see that the negative connotation persisted in this time period. In the 1940s, the term once again came back into more common use. And the shift continued, as in this 1940 article about the city of St. Petersburg featuring in a national magazine, which stated, "The highlight of the magazine feature is a double picture layout on the first page, which depicts the extremes in beauty for what it captions snowbirds and sun worshippers." Yet this 1948 article stated, "Transient vets create problem. Serious problems facing St. Petersburg's veterans groups that indulge in the luxury of maintaining downtown clubhouses involves taking care of snowbirds, the penniless transient veterans who flock south each winter." So while the trend toward the word being used in a more positive or neutral manner, it still continued to be somewhat negative, but maybe not quite as bad as it had been in the previous decades. However it was used in the papers, it obviously was still being used frequently as a negative by the locals, as seen here in a 1949 article, in which a couple wrote a letter to the editor complaining, "A past 40 problem here. We love St. Petersburg and want to stay, but we are not finding that St. Petersburg wants us or needs us in any capacity. And why? Because we are over 40 and new arrivals. Apparently, one must be established here for at least 2 years to overcome the suspicion of being a transient snowbird, etc." Today, we tend to think of snowbirds as mainly being retirees, but as you can see, that was not always the case. In the 1950s and 60s, the shift in how the term snowbird was used began to accelerate. While you still find articles such as this 1959 one, which states, "One defect in the unemployment insurance law is that in good times it rewards drifters, snowbirds, and floaters who are not actually a part of the state workforce." While this negative use of the term continued, more and more often it became used as a neutral or even positive term. As you can see here in the upper photo, they even included a Mr. and Mrs. Snowbird in a parade. You also saw an increase in the number of articles, such as this classified ad for a rental, which stated, "Snowbird nests for Mr. and Mrs. Winter Visitor." And even in 1967, an article which stated, "The Snowbirds, as the winter tourists are affectionately called." By the 1970s, the shift in how the term snowbird was used was complete. Every article that I found used it in either a neutral or positive manner, such as this 1970 article, which stated, "Whatever impels a snowbird, that is, a person who flees the snow scene up north for the warmth of gentler climes, to pick St. Petersburg." And in 1972, a color film of the Masters Golf Tournament will be shown at a meeting of the Snowbirds at Panama City Civic Center tonight. Even the winter tourists started to call themselves snowbirds. And in 1973, the Naples Cruise Club is governed by an executive committee and a snowbird committee, which they defined as seasonal residents. And a month later, this article in Panama City stated, the skyline at the Panama City Beach Civic Complex received an additional silhouette when 2 new flagpoles were dedicated, and one will bear the Canadian flag, emblematic of our snowbird visitors from September to March. Thank you all for joining me as we took this trip down Florida's memory lane.